I have watched 1,144 tribunals from this gallery. I have filed 1,144 accounts into the Duran archive, each one careful, each one complete, each one read by no one. This is the only account I have read back to myself. I needed to make sure I had not invented it. The light went first. That is the part I return to when I try to explain it to those who were not there. The way the vault of precedence bioluminescent system, keyed to the legal database since the original construction, dropped from full brightness to near nothing in a single step. Not a flicker, not a slow fade. One step, 1.2 million provisions, then 4. The light understood before the arbiter did. 9 seconds of dark. No verdict, no declaration, no sound at all. Then the light came back at a frequency I had no name for. Not the gold white of maximum legal load that I had watched for 200 years. Something lower, something the Accord's chromatic record did not contain, because the state it pointed to had never existed before. Prime Arbiter Chorethvel opened its primary archive. 4 sentences. It opened the secondary. 2 provisions, both from Article 1's original commentary, both older than the Accord's founding. It opened the tertiary. Empty. I have watched species beg in this chamber. I have watched them rage. I have watched them go quiet in the particular way of things that have given up on being heard. In 200 years of proceedings, I had never seen a prime arbiter search its own legal database and find nothing. I did not know that was possible. I did not know what Chorethvel's bioluminescent throatridge would do when it had no precedent left to process. In 1,144 hearings, that ridge had flickered without stopping, a constant, restless light, reading its own archive in real time, cross-referencing, citing, building. It went still. That stillness was the most frightening thing I had witnessed in 2 centuries of watching. Dr. Solon Avarice was not looking at the arbiter. She was looking at the walls, at the names of laws carved into the stone in the original script of whichever species first proposed them, at the oldest carvings, worn to illegibility by 900 years of pressurized atmosphere, worn so smooth they had stopped being words and become simply texture, shapes that the stone had absorbed until there was no difference between the law and the rock that held it. She pressed her left thumbnail into the center of her right palm. She said nothing. The part that still troubles me, even now, 14 years after I filed this account, is what she chose to leave in. Stay with me. 9 years earlier, by Duran count, I first came to substation Callow 9. I want to be accurate about why. I was not summoned. I had no standing to be summoned. I came because I had been filing accounts of pentarchy proceedings for 200 years, and I had developed, across those 200 years, a sense for which proceedings would be worth filing. I had not always been right, but the notice of a civilizational standing tribunal for humanity, a species 9 years under review, arriving without pentarchy-approved legal representation, with a 6-person team and a rented storage bay, felt like something I should see. I stayed 14 hours that first visit. I came back 37 more times over the following 8 months. The smell of substation Callow 9 was the smell of overworked air. The recycling system was undersized for the number of people using it, and no one had done anything about this because there were always more pressing things to do. It smelled like recycled warmth and old data chip plastic, and faintly, whatever the team had last eaten, which was usually something brought from home, never discussed as ritual, always present. Someone put food on the equipment crate that served as a table every 18 hours without fail. I watched this happen on every visit. I do not know who started it. The space was 18 meters by 9, every wall covered in printed law. They called it the Wound Archive. Consul Davin Preth had named it that, though he denied this when asked. He was 58 years old, heavyset, with the particular walk of someone whose knees had been damaged slowly over many years without a single dramatic cause. He read provisions aloud to himself while pacing, a low, steady murmur, the sound of someone measuring the floor in legal text. He claimed it helped him find the wound beneath the rule faster than reading in silence. After 340,000 pages read this way over 9 years, I believed him. His knees did not improve. Dr. Iyara Kas sat at a workstation in the northeast corner and almost never moved from it. She was 34, with the look of someone who had decided early that economy of motion was a form of precision. She had translated the Pentarchy's legal code from 14 different legal languages into a single working syntax, a project that had taken her 3 years and which she described, when I finally asked her about it, as removing the translation layer so we could see what the thing actually said. On her desk, touching the left edge of her workstation screen, sat a small flat river stone from her home city. She touched it before answering any question. Not for comfort, she said, for weight. She needed something that did not move while everything else did. Os Itambura was 67, retired from the bench after a career that had included more losses than any judge in his country's recent record. Avarice had brought him specifically for this. She wanted someone who understood losing from the inside, who had sat with a verdict that went wrong and had not looked away from what that meant. He read slowly and slept often, and on day 847 of their internal count, he fell asleep during a review session and woke to find someone had arranged 12 empty data chip cases in a small fence around his head. No one admitted responsibility. The fence appeared twice more over the following months, slightly more elaborate each time. He never mentioned it, neither did anyone else. And then there was avarice. I will try to describe what I saw on the day I first watched her enter the wound archive. She did not look at the walls, which held 9 years of printed law. She looked at the floor. Then she pressed her left thumbnail into the center of her right palm, a habit I would learn to recognize as the external sign of a mind working through something large. And she said, to no one in particular and to all 6 people in the room, we are not here to defend humanity's laws. We are here to find out if law can be defended at all. No one answered. Preth kept pacing. Kas touched her river stone. Tambura turned a page. This was, I understood later, the correct response. She did not reach for a weapon or a document that first day, or on any of the days that followed. When she needed to think, she reached into her left breast pocket and touched the seed, cold, smooth, carrying the exact weight of a thing that cannot be undone. It was a pale gray seed, 4 centimeters long, oval, slightly translucent at the narrow end. It had belonged to a botanist who spent 40 years cataloging extinct species and died before the hearing began. The seed was from the last known specimen of a tree that once grew only on a single continent, a continent humanity had destroyed in its 22nd century, before it had left its own atmosphere, before it had any concept that the Pentarchy Accord was watching. The seed had not been planted because no soil on Earth would accept it anymore. Avarice kept it in her pocket. She did not explain it. I did not ask. The methodology of the wound archive took me 3 visits to fully understand. Every provision the team reviewed was logged not by subject area, not by species of origin, not by date. It was logged by the wound it had been written to address. What broke first? What broke badly enough that someone wrote a rule about it after? They called this the scar map. After 9 years, the scar map contained 1.2 million entries. The walls were color-coded by wound category. One color in particular, a deep, flat red, appeared on 63,447 entries clustered in sections that Preth had started calling the recovery wards, which was his way of marking provisions that punished repair. It was Tambura who first said it clearly, on what their internal count marked as day 1089. He had been reading aloud, pacing, and he stopped mid-sentence and stood very still. This one, he said, this one made healing a crime. No one looked up immediately. This was not because they were indifferent. It was because they had been expecting it. Preth kept pacing. Kas made a mark in her syntax log. Avarice pressed her thumbnail into her palm. Tambura sat down. He read to the end of the provision. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, they wrote a law against getting better. The provision was Accord Statute 7, 441, b, subsection Roman 4, which had been inserted into the Pentarchy's governing code 440 years ago during what the Accord called the consolidation period. It made unilateral species-level restoration activity, the act of repairing damage done to a species by another civilization, a violation of sovereignty protocol, unless prior approval was obtained from a body that had not convened in 200 years and had no clear mechanism for convening. In practice, it meant that if you were wounded, you needed permission to heal. Statute 7,441b was not unusual. It was one of 63,447 provisions that shared the same wound in the SCAR map's red category, not cruelty healing, the act of repairing what was broken. 63,000 laws against recovery, accumulated across 900 years, each one written to solve a specific problem, and each one adding its weight to a structure that had stopped being able to ask whether the weight served anyone. I remember that Cass set down her river stone when the final count was confirmed. She picked it up again after a moment, but she had set it down. This was, in my experience of watching Dr. Iyara Cass across many months, unprecedented. I have tried to be accurate in this account about what I understood and when. I had been filing accounts of pentarchy proceedings for 200 years when Avris's team began their work. I had never been asked to testify. My records had never been entered as evidence. The pentarchy did not know my records existed. They had never found reason to ask whether a Darhan archivist with no legal standing and no Accord membership had been sitting in observation galleries for 2 centuries and writing down everything she saw. Avris knew. I do not know how she found it. I did not ask. What I can file into the record is that on day 341 of the Wound Archive, she looked up from her workstation, looked directly at the unpressurized observation ring above the north wall, and said, to the empty room, "The Darhan have been keeping accounts of Accord proceedings for how long?" I was not in the room, but Preth was. He looked at the ceiling, then at Avris, and said, 200 years, give or take, and the Accord has seen these accounts. No. Avris pressed her thumbnail into her palm. She nodded once. She went back to her workstation. 2 days later, she sent a request through the Darhan's informal communication channel, not to me specifically, as I was not on any official contact list, but into the channel itself, which I monitored as a matter of professional habit. The request was simple. She wanted to know whether the accounts were accurate. I filed a response saying they were. She filed a response asking whether I would be willing to enter them as documentary evidence under the pentarchy's own provision for historical records from non-testifying entities. A provision the Accord had written in year 12 of its existence to allow geological survey to be admitted as background evidence in land use hearings. I considered this for a long time, longer than I will record here. I filed a response saying yes. For the next 8 months, Avris's team reviewed my accounts the same way they reviewed the SCAR map, slowly, carefully, looking for the wound beneath the record. What they found, in 1,144 accounts of pentarchy proceedings, were 9 cases in which the Accord's own internal notation showed that the presiding arbiters had privately concluded that the species being judged had been legally correct and had ruled against them anyway. 9 cases out of 1,144. The notations were not in the public record. They were in the Accord's internal archive. They had never been filed for review. They had never been flagged as contradictions. They had simply been written, noted, and buried under 900 years of provisions. On day 2847 of the Wound Archive, which was, by Earth calculation, a Thursday, 9 years and 17 days after the review period began, Avris's team completed the SCAR map. They had logged every provision. They had applied a single test to each one. The test was not complex. The test was, can this law be explained in one sentence to a child in a way that makes sense? The provisions that passed were kept. The ones that failed were removed from the working document. Of 1.2 million provisions, 4 sentences survived. Preth read them aloud that night, standing in the middle of the room, to the blank walls where 1.2 million pages had been pinned for 9 years. He read them once. Then he put on his jacket and went asleep for 11 hours. Nobody decorated his head while he slept. The shuttle to the vault of precedent from substation Callow 9 takes 40 minutes on a standard approach. Avris's team boarded at the second scheduled departure of the hearing day, the one most delegations ignored because Arriving before the session began was considered a sign of anxiety. The Pentarchy's protocol read this signal as weakness. Avarice had read the protocol. She had also read the provision that governed where the party under review was required to sit during proceedings. It specified that the accused party must remain seated throughout the hearing, except when called to the lectern by the presiding arbiter. The provision had been written, Cass had determined, to keep accused delegations from approaching the Accord's bench uninvited. It had never been read, Tambura noted dryly, as an instruction to stay in one's chair and let the chair do the work. Avarice arrived at the vault without visible preparation. She carried no documents. She had her jacket pocket and whatever was in it. I was already in the observation ring when they entered. I had been there since 6 hours before the session opened, because the observation ring for non-testifying species is unpressurized and therefore not regulated by the Accord's access schedule. I had come in through the maintenance seal used by species who breathe vacuum. The orange songholder Merv was already there when I arrived. She had been there for 9 hours. Merv was small, even by orange standards, hollow-boned, with iridescent old feathers that shifted from deep green to bronze in the vault's ambient temperature. She stood at the forward rail of the observation ring and had not moved from that position since I arrived. She was not singing, but there was something about her stillness that felt like a note held just below the range of hearing. The Pentarchy had banned orange songs as legally inadmissible testimony 300 years ago, on the grounds that oral records could not be verified by written means. Merv had come anyway. I noted this, I noted it carefully. The chamber below us filled slowly. The Vithrani delegation arrived in a group, bilateral, four-armed, their photosensitive crests running a pale amber, which in their color system I understood as formal readiness. The Caliph representative moved to its designated station by pressure and vibration, as always, its seven-fold body reading the room through the floor. Across the observation ring, in the section accessible from the Heshari service corridor, 3 figures in the dense, low-profile shape of Heshari miners stood without moving, close to the wall. They were not supposed to be here. Preservation status species are not permitted in Accord tribunals, even as unofficial observers. The Durin's informal channels had helped with access. I will not specify further. Chorathvel entered last, which was protocol. It was 3.1 meters tall, pale gold, its exoskeletal carapace catching the chamber's light in faint halos at each joint. It hunched slightly on approach to the bench. The particular deliberate hunch it used when addressing delegations it had already categorized as lesser. I had watched it do this 1,144 times. It settled. Its throat ridge flickered once, a rapid, automatic census of the room's legal database connections. The chamber's bioluminescent system was at maximum. It was, I noted into my account in real time, the brightest I had ever seen it. 1 provision, 1 lumen, 1.2 million provisions. Chorathvel opened the session without preamble. In 1,144 hearings, it had never used preamble. It presented humanity's file, 204 jurisdictions operating under parallel and sometimes contradicting legal systems, 9 years of review, chronic internal contradiction, a failure to achieve civilizational legal coherence by any standard metric the Accord recognized, and placed the case for preservation status clearly on the record. The case was legally solid. Then Chorathvel asked the accused delegation whether it had a response. Dr. Solon Avarice adjusted the position of her right hand on the table, placing it flat, fingers spread. A small motion. Tessavar, that is, I, filing this account, read it as the motion of someone placing something into position before beginning. She said, before we answer whether our laws are sufficient, the Accord should first define what law is for. A pause, longer than was standard between statements. Chorathvel's throat ridge flickered in the pattern I had learned to read as procedural recitation, the precitation flicker, always the same. Law, it said, is the codified agreement of a civilization's behavioral norms. Avarice, then a law that prevents a parent from teaching a child to count, is a behavioral norm. By the definition you just gave, is that the civilization you are measuring us against. The Vithrani crest ran a brief pulse of violet, then back to amber. Chorethvel did not answer the question. It redirected to humanity's internal contradictions. The scar map, now turned against its makers. Jurisdiction 1, prohibiting what Jurisdiction 2 required. Provision sets that had accumulated over centuries without revision, containing contradictions that should have been resolved, but had not been. The Accord's standard brief for species under civilizational review. Avarice let it run. When Chorethvel finished, she said, "We are not disputing that our laws contain wounds. We are asking whether yours do too. The difference is, we found ours." She placed Kaas's single syntax document into the record, the unified translation of the Pentarchy's 1.2 million provisions, cross-indexed with the scar map's wound categories. The 63,447 provisions criminalizing healing were listed by number, date, and originating species. The Vithrani delegation conferred in bioluminescent flicker. I read it, as best I could across the distance and the glass of the observation ring, as distress. Chorethvel moved to strike the submission as outside the scope of the hearing. The motion required 3 Accord members to second it. 2 did. The Caliph representative did not move. Chorethvel held the motion for 6 seconds, I counted, then withdrew it without comment. It invoked 900 years of precedent instead. No species had successfully challenged the Accord's legal standing in this chamber. The record supported this absolutely. 1,144 hearings. 0 reversals of Accord authority. Avarice waited. Then she said, "No species has had access to 200 years of unofficial records of these proceedings. We do." She entered the Durin archive into the record. Not as official testimony, the Durin have no standing, and I had none, but as documentary evidence under Provision 3C of the Accord's founding code, the clause written in year 12 to admit geological surveys into land use hearings. Kaas had identified it. It was still active. It had never been repealed because no one had thought to repeal a geological survey provision. The archive was 1,144 accounts, 200 years of proceedings, unofficial, complete, accurate, including 9 cases in which the Accord's own internal notation showed a private acknowledgement that the species being judged had been legally correct, and a ruling against them anyway. Chorethvel did not speak for 47 seconds. I counted. Its throat ridge was absolutely still for the first 23 of them. Then it began a slow, irregular flicker, not citation, not cross-reference, not anything I had a name for in 200 years of watching it work. Something searching, something that was not finding what it was looking for. In the observation ring, Merv had not moved. Her old feathers had shifted to a deep, dark bronze. The color, in the ambient drop of the chamber's temperature, of something held very carefully. The Heshari figures near the corridor wall had not moved. The Caliph representative was still. The chamber held what 47 seconds of silence feels like in a pressurized room full of beings who have just watched 900 years of precedent become a question. Chorethvel's throat ridge had been still for 47 seconds when it found its voice again. Not to answer, to invoke. Emergency Continuity Protocol 7, it said. The citation came out with the weight of something used before, used often, used without doubt. In the event that a legal crisis of civilizational scale threatens the procedural integrity of this body, the sitting arbiters may, upon unanimous vote, suspend any provision of the foundational code for a period not to exceed 40 standard cycles. Avarice looked up from the table for the first time since she had placed her hand flat on its surface. She said, "That provision was removed from the archive 9 hours ago." A pause, not 47 seconds, shorter, harder. It failed the test. The chamber did not make a sound. The Vithrani crest ran a fast, involuntary pulse, deep violet, the stress color I had read in their delegates before, but faster than I had ever seen it cycle. The Caliph representative pressed itself slightly lower against the floor. The Heshari near the corridor wall were absolutely still. Chorethvel's throat ridge began to flicker in what I can only describe as a searching pattern, not citation, not cross-reference, looking for something that was not there. The provision, Avarice said, read as follows. She did not open a document. She had it by memory, which I note because it matters. In the event that a legal crisis of civilizational scale threatens the procedural integrity of the Accord's governing framework, the sitting arbiters may, upon unanimous vote, suspend any provision of the foundational code for a period not to exceed 40 standard cycles, provided that the suspension is logged in the primary archive within 6 cycles of invocation. She let that sit in the air of the chamber for a moment. Can you explain that to a child in one sentence? Chorethvel did not answer. We applied the same test to your code that we applied to ours, Avarice said. Every provision, one at a time. The ones that could not be explained in a single clear sentence to someone who had not already decided to trust the system, those were removed. Emergency Continuity Protocol 7 was removed at the 3rd hour of last night. It was the 1,199,996th provision we reviewed. I was watching Chorethvel's secondary limbs. In 1,144 hearings, those limbs had always rested flat, the pentarchy's posture for authority in session. 2 of them had shifted barely to a weight-forward position. I had only ever seen that position when a species was preparing to leave the bench. It did not leave. It opened the secondary database instead. The search took 4 seconds longer than database searches had ever taken in my experience of watching them. I do not know whether that matters technically. I am filing what I observe. The secondary returned 2 provisions, both from Article 1's original commentary, both predating the Accord's founding by 200 years. Chorethvel opened the tertiary. Empty. There was no emergency provision. There was no continuity clause. There was no floor. Avarice adjusted her right hand on the table. A small motion, she moved it 1 centimeter to the left. That was all. Then she looked at Chorethvel with an expression that Tessivar, filing this account now, still cannot name with full confidence. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was the look of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time, and has placed it down, and is watching to see whether the place it landed will hold it. She said, round 5. She had been seated for the entire hearing. This was not an accident. Provision 44. A of the Accord's procedural code specified that the party under review must remain seated throughout proceedings, except when called to the lectern by the presiding arbiter. It was written to keep accused delegations from approaching the Accord's bench uninvited. Koss had identified it as a constraint. Tambura had read it a second time and said, quietly, that it was also an instruction, that the chair was not a limitation, the chair was a position. Avarice had not stood once. She placed her hand flat on the table again. She said, I want to read something into the record. Article 1 of the Pentarchy Accord, the founding clause, predating every provision we have discussed today. Chorethvel did not object. There was, at that point, nothing procedural left to object with. Avarice read, a civilization demonstrates legal standing by demonstrating that its laws serve its people. She read it once. She looked at the walls, at the names of laws worn into the stone, in scripts belonging to species who had written them centuries ago, at the oldest carvings, worn smooth by 900 years of pressurized atmosphere until they were no longer words, only shapes, only the memory of a mark pressed into rock by someone who believed, at the time of pressing, that the mark would last. She pressed her thumbnail into the center of her right palm, hard enough that the mark it left was visible afterward, from the observation ring. When she lifted her hand, she said, by your own standard written before any of the rest, which civilization in this chamber currently has legal standing. She said nothing else. She did not need to. From the observation ring, the songholder Merv began to sing. Not testimony, not a formal record. A single note, one frequency, held with the absolute precision of someone who had been waiting 9 hours for the exact moment when it would be the right thing to do. I have spent a long time trying to find the words for what that note sounded like. The closest I can come is this. It was the sound a door makes when it has been closed for so long that opening it requires 2 things at once, the sound of the hinge, and the sound of the air rushing in to fill the space that had been empty without anyone knowing it was empty. Merv held the note. She held it until something changed in the chamber below. The light went first. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the account that I was most afraid no one would believe, and it is also the part I am most certain I did not invent. The vault of precedence bioluminescent system was an administrative relic, keyed to the legal database at the time of original construction, never updated, never reviewed, because no one had ever needed to update or review a system that simply counted what existed and made light accordingly. One provision, one lumen. For 900 years, the light had been a way of knowing how full the archive was. At the start of the hearing, the archive held 1.2 million provisions. The chamber was at maximum brightness. It was, I had noted in real time, the brightest I had ever seen it. The database now held 4. The light did not dim slowly. There was no flicker, no gradual fade, no warning of any kind. It dropped in one step from full to near nothing, and the chamber was dark. 4 sentences and 900 years of law. 4 sentences where a civilization used to be. 9 seconds. I counted. I count everything. It is the habit of my kind, and in that darkness it was the only thing I could do, count and breathe, and keep my outer eyelids open, because I needed to be sure I was witnessing and not dreaming. Then the light came back, at a frequency I had no name for, not the gold-white of maximum legal load, not any color in the Accord's chromatic record of legal states. Something lower and steadier than anything I had seen the system produce. A frequency that corresponded to a state the system had never been asked to represent before, because the state had never existed before. Chorethvel opened the primary archive. 4 sentences. It opened the secondary. 2 provisions from Article 1's original commentary. It opened the tertiary, and its bioluminescent throatridge, which had flickered through 1,144 hearings, which had cross-referenced and cited and searched and found, which had never in my 200 years of watching it gone still, went completely still. Not off, not dark, still, like something that had run out of the thing it was built to do. Avarice was not looking at the arbiter. She was looking at the walls, at the blank spaces between the carvings, places where something had once been pressed into the stone and was now simply gone, not erased but dissolved, worn away by time until it was indistinguishable from the surface it had marked. She was looking at these spaces the way you look at something you have been thinking about for a long time and are finally seeing at the right distance. The 4 sentences in the Pentarchy's archive were: a civilization demonstrates legal standing by demonstrating that its laws serve its people. Law exists to name what was broken. Law exists to stop the break from happening again. When the law becomes the break, it must be removed. Chorethvel's secondary limbs did not return to flat position. It did not declare a verdict. It did not adjourn the session. It did not speak. In the observation ring, Merv held her note until the last member of a Pentarchy delegation passed through the pressure door at the far end of the chamber, a Vithrani junior delegate who moved slowly, looking back twice before the seal closed. Then she stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of something that had been full for a very long time and had just been set down. The Heshari near the corridor wall filed out without speaking. One of them pressed their hand flat against the chamber wall as they passed through the service door. They did not look back. I filed that detail. I do not know what it meant. I am filing what I saw. Within 6 standard hours of the session's end, the 14 species currently held in preservation status received automated notifications that their cases were under review. The notifications used language from Article 1. No other legal basis was cited, because no other legal basis currently existed. Chorethvel filed the legal review status request for the Pentarchy Accord itself 3 hours after that. It was the first time in 900 years that the Accord had applied to itself the same classification it used for species under evaluation. The filing used 4 sentences as its entire legal basis. It cited no other precedent. It was signed by Chorethvel alone. I have not seen Chorethvel in any official proceeding since that filing. This is not, I should note, because it was removed or expelled. AF6 is the classification I would use in a formal record. Disappeared. Not gone. Simply no longer present in any proceeding I have been able to observe or find in any record I have access to. A name that appears in the filing and then stops appearing. I found Tambura in substation Calo 9 at what would have been approximately 4 a.m. on Earth. He was the only person still awake in the team's section. He was sitting on the equipment crate that had served as a table for 9 years, eating something he had brought from his bag, reading nothing. He looked up when I came in. He was not startled, which told me he had heard the maintenance seal cycle. He said, "You stayed." I said I had. I asked whether Avarice was sleeping. He said she was. Then he said, "She regrets the one she had to leave in." I asked which one she had left in. He said, "The provision that makes oral records admissible under the documentary evidence clause." She left it. She said it was the only one that would last long enough to matter. He finished what he was eating. He set the wrapper flat on the crate and pressed it smooth the way someone does when they are not thinking about what their hands are doing. 4 sentences, he said. Not to me specifically. To the room or to himself or to the walls where the printed law had been for 9 years and was now simply blank. I said, 4 more than they needed to keep going. He looked at me. Then he said, "And 1 less than they'd need to stop us." He went to sleep after that. I sat in the room for a while. The walls were blank in a way that was different from the blankness of a wall that has never held anything. It was the blankness of a space that had been full and knew it. This account was filed into the Darhan Informal Archive 14 years after the hearing. In those 14 years, 9 of the 14 species held in preservation status have had that status formally removed. 3 cases remain under review. 2 have been reclassified under a legal framework that did not exist before the hearing, a framework built, as far as I can determine, from Article 1 and the documentary evidence provision Avarice chose to leave intact. The Heshari keeper of receipts transmitted her full biological memory sack to the Darhan archive the day after the hearing. It contained 140 years of documented violations, a record of everything done to her species under legal cover, kept in the body of one person who had watched every case and said nothing because there had been nowhere to say it. The archive now has it. I have filed it. Someone will find it. The Orange songholder Merv returned to the observation ring twice in the year following the hearing. Each time she sang the full evidentiary record of the proceedings, a 4-hour account, note perfect, covering every exchange from Chorathvel's opening statement to the moment the light changed. The second time, 3 other Oran joined her. I filed all of it. The wound archive at substation Calo 9 was vacated 11 days after the hearing. The team took their personal items. They left the printed law on the walls. All of it, 9 years of provisions, the scar map's color coding, the red of 63,447 healing bands still visible across 3 full sections of wall. A Heshari work crew contracted for the station's next maintenance cycle arrived 40 days later and found the walls covered in text they had no context for. They filed a query about whether the walls should be cleaned and repainted. No one ever answered. Avarice came to the observation ring on the morning after the hearing, before the shuttle schedule had started. She came through the maintenance seal, which meant she had found the access code, which meant she had known it existed, which I do not know how to account for except to say that by then I had stopped being surprised by what Avarice knew and had not mentioned. She sat at the forward rail, where Merv had stood. She looked at the chamber below. The light was still at the new frequency. It had not been reset because no one had yet determined what it should be reset to. She reached into her breast pocket and took out the seed, 4 centimeters long, pale gray, slightly clear at one end, in the way of something that had been handled many times over many years, and had taken on the particular smoothness of an object that has been held when there was nothing else to hold. She looked at it for a while. Then she held it out to me. I took it. Not to plant, not to save, only so something that had survived this long would be held by someone who would remember holding it. She left through the maintenance seal without speaking. I heard the seal close behind her with the small, specific sound of pressurized air finding its level. the sound of a space returning to what it is when no one is in it. I held the seed in my forward limb. I looked at the chamber below, at the light that had no name yet, at the walls carved with laws worn to shapes, at the blank spaces between them. The seed had no soil. The law had no floor. She left both where they landed.